This is SPE paper 215060, effect of residual oil saturation and salinity on polyacrylamide rheology in porous media. And if you'd like this paper, you can either download it from my website or from SPE's One Petro site. So I'm Randy C. Wright with New Mexico Tech, and my co-authors on this paper are Mader Azad, Mohammed Abdullah, and Mojda Delshad. This project came about because during separate work, our group is asking the question, how does polymer rheology affect fracture extension and mobilization of capillary trapped residual oil during polymer flooding? And while setting up the calculations and simulations to answer that question, we realized that certain critical experimental data and behavior was lacking for polyacrylamide rheology in porous media as a function of oil saturation, salinity, and temperature. So our goal in this work was to experimentally determine the correct rheology for polyacrylamide solutions in porous media as a function of oil saturation, salinity, and temperature. And we're going to start by looking at the effect of oil saturation. For a long time, we've known that if there's no oil present in the porous rock, then the rheology of polymer solutions in porous media correlates very well with 1 over the square root of permeability times porosity. And that point's illustrated in this little plot here, where we're plotting resistance factor, or the apparent viscosity of a polyacrylamide solution in porous media relative to water. And we're plotting that versus the Darcy velocity times this permeability porosity function. And when we make the plot in that way, you can see that over a very wide range of permeability, all of the resistance factor data points basically fall on the same line. Okay, so again, if there's no oil present in the porous rock, then the apparent viscosity, or the rheology of polyacrylamide solutions in porous media, correlates very well with 1 over the square root of permeability times porosity. And it turns out that finding has been essential for simulation of polymer flooding and chemical flooding processes over the past 50 years when you have layered reservoirs that have layers of different permeability. Now, of course, we know that if oil is present, that's going to reduce the effective aqueous phase porosity some, but it's going to dramatically reduce the permeability to water. And what simulators have simply done over the past 50 years is to just assume that the polymer rheology in porous media is going to just shift in accordance with whatever reduction in permeability and aqueous phase porosity that is caused by the presence of the oil. So that raises the question then, if oil is present, is this square root of permeability porosity relationship really valid? Well, back in 1988, Bill Cannella presented a paper where he looked at xanthan rheology in Berea sandstone, and as a part of his work, he had 2 cases where a residual oil saturation was present, and he concluded that for his conditions, this square root of permeability porosity relationship was indeed still valid. But if we look at some published data from more recent sources that I have listed here, that raises the question about whether this relationship is valid or not. In particular, what these folks did was to determine polymer rheology in porous media first without any oil saturation present, and then they established a residual oil saturation and determined polymer rheology again. And although these authors did not say this, if you look at their data, it looks very much like this square root of permeability porosity relationship does not work if oil is present. So that presents a problem for us, of course, because we need to know whether this relationship is valid when we performed our simulations for polymer flooding or chemical flooding processes. A large part of our paper is concerned with describing the experimental setup, how we perform the experiments, the experimental results, and then validation of those results. Because of time limitations, I'm just going to refer you to the paper to get all of those details. And here I'm just going to jump to the bottom line where we're plotting the polyacrylamide rheology in porous media for a polymer solution that contains 1,000 parts per million polymer in 1% sodium chloride, 0.05% calcium chloride. This is all done in a 210 millidarcy Berea sandstone core at 20 degrees centigrade. And when oil is present, it is a 210 centipoise mineral oil. And you can see we've determined polymer rheology in porous media for this particular formulation at 5 levels of oil saturation, ranging from 0 up to 0.55, and that translates to relative permeabilities to water ranging from 1 down to 0.03. Now, if the standard square root of permeability porosity model was valid, then all of the resistance factor data points ought to fall on the same curve, which is specifically this black dash curve with the solid red triangles. And in looking over this plot, you can see both good news and bad news. The good news is that the standard square root of permeability porosity model that we've been assuming in our chemical flooding simulators over the past 50 years works pretty well so long as the velocity in porous media is less than about 3 times the minimum in these rheological curves, or some would say 3 times the onset of shear thickening behavior in porous rock. Okay, so that's the good news. The bad news is that when we go to velocities higher than this particular value, then the standard square root of permeability porosity model seems to break down. In particular, when you get into the high velocity viscoelastic region for these polyacrylamides, the resistance factor moderates or decreases fairly substantially with increased oil saturation. So to summarize what I've just shown you in the previous slide, for velocities less than about 3 times the onset of shear thickening behavior, the standard square root of permeability porosity model fits the data pretty well. And that finding should be of great comfort to polymer flooding and chemical flooding simulators over the past 50 years because it says you didn't just simply waste your lives. But we need to point out that this square root of permeability porosity assumption and our data is not consistent with the data from these 4 authors that were reported fairly recently. So the real point here is that more experimental work needs to be done to make sure of exactly when this square root of permeability porosity relationship is valid and when it's not valid. Okay, so this is all relative to what happens at low velocities, like you might have deep in a reservoir where the vast majority of the oil is going to be displaced. Now let's turn to look at what happens at high velocities. For velocities greater than the onset of greater than 3 times the onset of shear thickening behavior, the standard square root of permeability porosity model did not work very well, and in particular the magnitude of the shear thickening resistance factors moderated or decreased fairly substantially with increased oil saturation. And we have to admit we don't know the reason mechanistically of why this is occurring. We offer a little bit of speculation in the paper, but the truth is we're going to need to perform some more experiments to figure out exactly why this behavior is occurring. Now, I also want to mention that this behavior that we're seeing in the high velocity region is consistent with these 4 authors that I mentioned. And the bottom line on all of this is that if you're using a conventional polymer flooding or chemical flooding simulator to project oil recovery deep, that's going to happen primarily deep in the reservoir where you have low velocities, you're probably okay. But if you're using one of these standard simulators to project what happens at high velocities, you're probably going to be off by a significant extent. In particular, you're going to predict the degree of fracture extension caused by the shear thickening behavior of polyacrylamide solutions, and you're going to overpredict the amount of capillary trapped residual oil that you could mobilize and displace as a result of the viscoelastic character of polyacrylamide solutions. So please take that into consideration when you're using these conventional polymer flooding and chemical flooding simulators. Okay, so that's our look at the effect of oil saturation on polyacrylamide rheology and porous media. So now let's look at the effect of salinity on polyacrylamide rheology and porous media. And we'll start by focusing on 1,000 part per million polyacrylamide in 293 millidarcy Berea sandstone. And for this case, there's no oil present in our porous rock. But we are going to look over a very wide range of salinity, ranging from a low of 0.105% total dissolved solids all the way up to 100 times that value at 10.5% total dissolved solids. And for all of these cases, the ratio of sodium chloride to calcium chloride was fixed at a value of 20:1. Now, in making these rheological plots, the first thing you're going to notice is that the lower the salinity, the overall level of resistance factor or viscosity provided by this 1,000 parts per million polymer increases fairly significantly. Well, that's not a surprise. We've really known that forever. But what is a bit of a surprise is that the minimum in these rheological curves occurred at about 0.47 feet per day over a very broad range of salinity. And the maximum resistance factor in the shear thickening region commonly occurred at 7.8 feet per day, again over a very broad range of salinity. Now you can see that statement breaks down when we get to the very highest salinities, but for the most part, the horizontal position or Darcy velocity dependence of these rheological curves did not really shift very much over a pretty broad range of salinity. So the work in the previous slide was focused on 1,000 part per million polyacrylamide. In this slide, we're performing the experiment again using 2,000 part per million polyacrylamide, and you can see we found a very similar result. Again, the minimum in the rheological curves occurred at about 0.47 feet per day over a broad range of salinity, and the maximum resistance factor in the shear thickening region commonly occurred at 7.8 feet per day over a broad range of salinity. So, to summarize what I've just showed you, the Darcy velocity associated with the onset of shear thickening was not particularly sensitive to salinity, and the velocity associated with the peak resistance factor in the shear thickening region was not very sensitive to salinity. Now, these findings may contradict some of the assumptions that have been input into previous simulation models for polymer flooding and chemical flooding. Some of those models, based strictly on intuition, assumed that the onset of shear thickening behavior should shift to higher Darcy velocities fairly significantly as you increased salinity of your solutions. And other people assumed, well, they looked at what happened to polymer rheology in a viscometer or a rheometer as a function of salinity, and just assumed that whatever they saw there ought to be valid in porous media as well. And what you can see from our results is that those assumptions may not be correct. And so the whole point of all of this then is you really need to be careful with this chemical flooding or polymer flooding simulator that you use to make sure that it really is not making assumptions that are not correct. And probably you should perform some experimental work to make sure that what you are assuming is consistent with what really happens under your conditions. Now, separate from this, I want to mention that in the paper we described that for a given velocity, we found that shear degradation becomes more severe as hardness and salinity increases. That's not a surprise. We've really known that for about 50 years. We're just confirming that. And like I say, that's detailed in the paper. So just please look at that. The final thing I'd like to discuss is the effect of temperature on polyacrylamide rheology in porous media. And let me introduce this by first saying that for a long time we have known that water viscosity decreases with increased temperature in a very predictable way. And a lot of polymer flooding and chemical flooding simulators have just simply incorporated that fact into their code. And what they do then is simply they simply predict resistance factor for the polymer solution based solely on that assumption. And so what that would predict then would be that if you look at a real rheological curves like we're doing here, you can see we've determined polyacrylamide rheology in porous media for 20, 40, and 60 degrees centigrade. So what the simulators would predict is that the minimum in these resistance factors, the Darcy velocity associated with the minimum resistance factor, would shift to higher values, higher Darcy velocities, in proportion to however water viscosity decreases with increased temperature. And if you look at our data, you can see that that is indeed consistent with what we're seeing in porous media. As we go from 20 to 40 to 60 degrees centigrade, the Darcy velocity associated with the minimum does indeed shift to higher values, and that the magnitude of that shift is very consistent with the drop in water viscosity as we increase the temperature. So that's the good news here. The bad news comes from looking at the overall level of resistance factor provided by the polymer solution. Now, resistance factor, by definition, already has incorporated into it the viscosity of water at the particular temperature of interest. So if you're using a conventional simulator, what it might predict is that the magnitude of the resistance factor at the minimum associated with 20 degrees centigrade would be the same as it is at 40 and 60 degrees centigrade. And if you look at our actual resistance factor data, you can see that that's not correct, that the resistance factor, the overall magnitude of the resistance factor in these entire rheological curves shift downward fairly significantly as we increased the temperature. Now, we've shown in the paper that this is not due to oxidative or shear degradation of the polymer. So we have to come up with another mechanistic reason for why the resistance factor is very definitely dropping significantly with increased temperature. So to get to my conclusions, we found that the standard square root of permeability porosity model, or shift factor, that we've been assuming in our polymer flooding and chemical flooding simulations over the past 50 years, we found that that was valid both with and without the presence of oil if the velocity is moderate or low. But we find that the correlation breaks down at high velocities in the shear thickening regime for polyacrylamide solutions. We found that increased oil saturation moderates or decreases fairly significantly the magnitude of polyacrylamide shear thickening when I'm in the high velocity shear thickening region. We found that the velocity for the onset of shear thickening was not particularly sensitive to salinity over a broad range. We found that polyacrylamide resistance factors decreased with increased temperature more than would be expected from consideration of how water viscosity varies with temperature. And that decrease could not be explained by polymer oxidative or mechanical degradation. So with that, I'm going to stop and again point out, if you'd like to read the entire paper here, please download that either from my website or else go to SPE's One Petro site, and then you can download the paper from that. And thank you so much for listening. To find my website, I have that listed right here at the very top of this page, or it may just be easier to Google RSC Right. And one of the top listings that will come up is this Reservoir Sweep Improvement, PRRC, and just click on that link. It'll take you directly to my website. So thank you.